I am joined by Glenn Jones, lead gameplay designer for Marvel Snap. A few weeks ago, I released a faux TA patch I wished would happen with the slightly presumptuous title of, okay, since they won't do it, I'll fix Marvel Snap, or something along those lines. Now, Glenn is here to say, okay, well, I'm going to fix your patch. This is Glenn's chance to tell me what I'm getting wrong about my ideas about balance from the outside. Just to sort of say like, hey, all right, you got a YouTube channel. It doesn't mean you can do my job. That's the premise of the video here. So I've listed the changes that I made on the side. We're going to go through them like group by group, I suppose. But before we do that, is there anything like out the outset you feel like needs to be said?
I mean, I'll start off with just saying, there's many roads to Rome, so to speak. So like you can definitely directionally do a lot of things in different ways, and a lot of the times we're just picking the one we think is best, or that contributes to some other goal, or that is diverse in some way with other changes we might be making in the future or have made in the past. So I tend to think of there's a lot less like right and wrong like choices and more like just right and wrong directions, like if you fail to nerf or buff a deck, like that can be a problem, but which card, that's a little bit more up for debate.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and that's probably a good framing device for like the first and like most obvious part of this. Sholau, my pitch for Sholau was 5/6 characters only. What they ended up doing was just 5/6. And I specifically wanted to drill down on characters only because I've had you on the channel before, and I've suggested what I think you could reasonably call like some hack solutions to things. Like saying, the Mockingbird doesn't count Thanos stones or whatever. And this feels like it is something in that vein. But at the same time, I do think in a case like this, there are it's like a legitimate gameplay case to be made for incentivizing a certain type of gameplay with this card rather than just free rolling it with cards like Merlin. What would you think about that kind of space?
Sure, I wouldn't characterize it the same as the like no stones Mockingbird type thing. Like I think it is a real like dial that we could consider turning. There are kind of two things about your change to Shao that I would highlight. Which is the first one is just its two changes. So a lot of the time we try and only make like one change if we're going to change something, because that lets us get a much stronger insight as the impact that particular change would have. Whereas, like let's say we did the two changes and then it turns out that it was an over nerf. We don't actually know which one to undo necessarily to get to the right spot. Whereas if we do one and it's still too strong, cool. Now we just throw the other one on and we have like a really solid idea of which one's going to have how much impact and can get to the right answer fairly quickly. And that's just like kind of a more general philosophy thing, which honestly, like it's pretty easy to do accidentally with snap cards. They only have two numbers and some words. So if you just only change one field, you're changing a third of the card a lot of the time anyway. So yeah, the specific change. So I think it's a reasonable direction to take. The big question it basically asks is, what kind of gameplay do we want Shao to have? And what was like the kind of the original promise or fantasy of the card? That's an area that I personally am like really conservative on. Like I don't really love changing a card so that it can no longer fulfill the fantasy upon which it was premised, which for good or ill with the original one was definitely like, hey, play a bunch of like skills and one cost skills and you can do this really powerful thing. So we'd basically be kind of dumpstering that idea and being like, all right, there's a whole other different deck now that's maybe more like Beast or Falcon or however you want to slice that particular archetype together. Not that it wouldn't be, likely a contender or have its own fun gameplay to perform, but it is like sort of a redirect of the card. And that's a little bit extreme for like the first nerf I would take. Like I think Loki's like a good example, even though I think that one is a good example of it kind of going bad, where like, we tried to maintain it as close as we could, and eventually we're like, okay, like we just gotta this is not working out. And I think we like, while it was painful to get to that final point on Loki, like we paid the maximum price. If it had worked out, we would have been pretty happy with the approach that we had. And the vast majority of the time it does work out, that we can maintain the original fantasy without having to disrupt it.
I think that's really interesting because a lot of why I put that restriction on the Sholau was my attempt to maintain the original fantasy. I just identified the original fantasy as +3 Like, that's what I identified the
Yeah.
fantasy as. And I was so much more reticent to be like, we need to cut that part off of the card, right? I felt like my approach to this was, what can I do to keep +3 on this card? That was like the overriding thought process. That was what I identified as the core of the card. And I think it's interesting that you identify the skill stuff as such a part of it, because to me, what I identify as the core of the card is the big number, like the dragon and the power.
Yeah.
And I just thought of the skill stuff as sort of ancillary, and that it isn't is interesting to me.
Yeah, I would say, like, I'm not saying that it's the exclusive or even the primary. Like, I agree, make big number is definitely, like, the core fantasy. But the manner in which you can achieve that was, like, left deliberately open-ended so that you could build both kinds of decks. And so slicing off one of them completely is, again, like, something we could do, but, like, and it's not, I'm not saying, like, then you're just playing with a big hit monkey, because it's still meaningfully different from that, for sure. But it does move kind of closer to something that we've seen before that is paying off more things that we've seen before. Like, in a way, what he's doing right now is kind of this, like, mixture of, like, it's neither zombie giant man nor is it hit monkey, but there's, like, a little bit of both flavors kind of mixed in there, while it is also holding on to a different identity unto itself. It even feels like a little like a kind of Shuri type deal, where you're using, like, him as kind of the interstitial thing. So it's mixing a lot of things together. And the area I'd be most inclined to make, like, kind of a rework type shift in that direction is, once we see, like, okay, actually one of these decks we don't really like. Like, it's not, whether it's a skill-based one or a character-based one, and then we could perhaps modulate to target one or the other. I do, of course, think that, like, the character-based one is almost certainly going to be, like, the healthier of the two, just by the structure of the game.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about Merlin explicitly in the video that I did, but I do think he is, like, the sort of proximate driver of why I'd want to do this. Like, Merlin is an offender in this area, where it's just,
that's one of the things has been surprising me, is how much of the feedback I've read has been around, like, Merlin took, like, a bullet for Shallow, and I'm like, Merlin was in the streets, he was carrying heat the whole time.
I think, if anything, like, the big driver for the characters thing for me was like, all right, let's decouple this so we can know which one is the problem here. Like, I don't want to let either one of them cover for the other one here. And I do think that it is one of those situations where these two are equal partners. This is that handshake from Predator. Like, those are equally jacked dudes doing that handshake there. It is not one carrying. They are very strong cards.
The current Merlin is actually, like, both of the changes we made. Like, I wanted to make one of those ahead of release. I felt like he was just too hot coming in, and we wound up letting it ride. And I think that it worked out okay. Like, I'm happy we did release the stronger version of the card, because it was, generally speaking, we always want to release the strongest one we think we can get away with. So that's ideal. And I think that's what we did with Merlin for a while. He's just in, like, a really interesting space where he's very dangerous. Like, he can do so much, and he's very hard to predict. So there's, like, concerns about how ubiquitous he might be, how much he might damage the playability of strategies, like, based around, I mean, to a lesser extent, Afflict, because he can wipe those, but specifically, like, Magic, he's very hostile to her. Obviously, like, we don't really mind that he gets Clog, because it's okay for Clog to be a hard deck to play into some metagames, but it is still a notable thing that's an archetype he damages. So yeah, like, he's just got, in addition to being a very strong card, he also affects the strength of a bunch of other decks. So he's a dangerous card to have be strong, and I'm happy he got to be as strong as he was for as long as he was, because, like I said, I probably would have taken some of that strength away if it was 100% my decision, which is why we have a range of people making these decisions to try and make sure we make the best one.
Yeah, Merlin and Magic specifically, like, I remember when Nocturne had to get nerfed because it was just too easy to include location control for free in your deck. And I think that if Merlin has a sin here, that is almost certainly his biggest one. It's not only that he's free rolling the Sholau stuff, it's that he's free rolling location control in a really meaningful way. Like, a lot of Sholau decks would get absolutely owned by Magic decks if this wasn't the case.
Yeah, I think that is true. I do think he's a little weaker than Nocturne in this regard. Like, I think part of the key strength of Nocturne was that you could, like, imbalance the locations when there's no longer any opportunity to play to them. Like you have just, you get to move her to somewhere nobody could play, and that was just like a bunch of free rolled wins. And Merlin's much worse at that, although he can still do it. Of course, it's just like your opponent gets a more even shot, I think, kind of to
like
to
he's
contend with you.
he's not winning you a Crimson Cosmos, nor is he playable into a Crimson Cosmos Nocturne. He's not winning you like a Sanctum Sanctorum Nocturne. She has a lot more free wins built in by virtue of being a move card. That is true. Next up, Agony / Maverick. This was something I went back and forth on. I did Agony to 1-2. In the actual patch, they did Maverick to 3-2. These are effectively like the same thing to me. Like I look at these and I'm like, I care less about Agony being good. I think to a degree, Maverick is a bigger problem, but he's also like a card that came out more recently that people paid for, that they are excited to be playing with, that is one of the few cards that came out in the last 2 months that is an absolute like A+ 5-star card. That was sort of my direction for hitting Agony instead, where it was like, this is a card that is an A+ 5-star card. People are really excited about it. There's like a bundle on sale with it as you guys are nerfing it. It comes out in the little pack that they did for the player who won the Snowball Showdown. Maverick was one of the highlighted cards in there. Is that... I don't really get the sense that you guys have the ability to integrate those things very heavily based on like things like this Maverick thing happening. And like previously there was one where like the $100 Cannonball bundle was going on sale. They nerfed Cannonball like the week before. Stuff like that, both directions. It feels like they're just teams operating on two different timelines just by the nature of what the job is. Are you guys able to even think about stuff like that? Like if I'm trying to get inside your head the next time I do one of these videos, do I just ignore that?
No, like we do think about that and evaluate it. It is definitely two teams kind of flying separately, but we do keep tabs on each other. Like we share forums and tend to go try and check the schedule before we lock in our changes. But that said, there's also kind of a band as to like, how much tolerance do we want to afford something like that? Like if there's another equally or maybe it's only slightly worse option to take, I'm mostly pretty happy to take the other option and see how it goes. Sometimes it's just more interesting too to like leave something strong. The concern I would have with Maverick specifically is there are kind of two questions that are worth asking when you're thinking about like, do I want to hit the guy or the helper? Which is like, if I hit the helper, like, do I still think there's like a reasonable chance that we're going to have a very similar kind of problem going on? And I think in this case, the answer is probably yes. Like, I'm not saying this is even a good idea, but like if everyone just cuts Agony from their decks and then just puts Nico some other card, in the slot or whatever, and it's just like, okay, like maybe the deck's like slightly worse at this particular version of the thing, but it's still doing a thing. That's a concern. And then the second one is like, well, if we nerf the main guy, like, is there still stuff to do with him? Like, are we taking him out back? And it's like, I don't think that's the case for one power off of this card that was already kind of premised around scaling its power. Like, if the difference between 3 and 2 was like the playability line for Maverick, then he'd probably already be unplayable, right? Because the difference between 3 and 4 is just not that far from 3 and 2. And we've all kind of universally agreed he was playable at 3. So I think it makes, if you're going to take a shot where it's like, well, it might miss, it makes a little bit more sense, I think, to take the harder shot on him and at least know that you addressed like the problem kind of head on. And I do think Agony is like a cool card. Outside of even like the recency bias around Maverick, like I think there's a lot of good reasons to want to kind of keep the more versatile merge card strong, since it can just tie into more things than Maverick can by virtue of its cost and applicability of effect. It's also kind of just more immediately appealing to people, I think, to see a 1/3. Like you're kind of conditioned, to be like, oh, like that's a good stat line to see. So having Agony be able to hold that line is a little more valuable. Like Maverick at 3/2 or 3/3 doesn't do a huge amount for his like immediate on read appeal to most people. It's not like it's 3/6 or whatever where you're like, okay, that card looks great. Like that would obviously be broken, but I'm assuming the text is in line.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I think largely that maybe I got a little gaslit by my friends on this one, because I made the patch and I was like, okay, I had originally Agony and Maverick both losing a point of power. And what I received as feedback from a lot of my friends who were good players was like, I think you're over nerfing this deck. I think you're being too harsh. And I think maybe that's true, but having seen 3-2 Maverick, I actually kind of don't think I was harsh enough. Like, I think I went the other way, and I was like, I got scared of making the change to Maverick, so I was like, okay, well, Shoalau's getting nerfed, you know, all this stuff is happening, and I don't want to be too harsh on it. And then when the actual patch came out, it was like, okay, so Spider-Ham's losing a point of power. Maverick's losing a point of power. Shoalau's losing 2 points of power. Merlin's Omniversal Presence is losing a point of power. It's like, oh, no, it actually is okay to just do like 5 points of power off of different cards in the deck. You could just do that. And I was a little worried about doing that.
Well, one of the advantages of that approach, like rather than go like hard on a small number of cards, is going like a little softer on a larger number. An upside of that is that it lets you kind of keep cards a little closer to replacement value. Like, you know, let's say Spider-Ham, like losing the power is like, okay, we got to cut Spider-Ham. It's like, well, you just put in a different 1-dropper. It's not that far of a departure, assuming you can find something else that is serving like a useful role to the deck. Whereas, you know, if you just hit the dragon, like suit so hard the deck dies or whatever, it's like, well, now it doesn't matter if there's a card that could sub out for Spider-Ham, right? Like, because nobody is using the card anymore. So
I pitched this suggestion in my faux TA, and then they did this one, and incredibly, I still feel like I got this wrong. Like, I pitched this, and I was like, I think this would be a great change. I think it would be a good thing to do. And it was so different from how I expected it to be. That this is, of course, Deafening Chord losing the Afflict.
The Afflict.
I was like, oh, this will be like a 15% change. You know, it won't really matter that much. I've cut Deafening Chord from like every deck. Like, that guy is just gone. Like, and again, you do like the, oh no, it's like, yeah, no, that's probably a good thing for the game that effect is not running around at 1 all the time. But I am just actually, I know in my head, 1 is infinitely more than 0. That's the most impactful 1 point of power you could ever have. But I do sort of wonder, like, there's a running gag on my podcast with Jerry Thompson that, you know, surgical with a wasp. You know, he's a big wasp guy. And this is sort of making me wonder if, like, maybe he's gone to something with the wasp. Like, if wasp was 2 power, would we be in trouble? Like, how meaningful is this? And it just feels like a lot of it is just like, especially in the context of Sholau, you're using it to free roll, right? If it doesn't have to hit anything, you're free rolling, you're totally happy with whatever happens, and you need to play 2 spells anyway. And I guess what I'm surprised by is how much Chord was subsidized by Sholau in a real way that I just didn't really process when I was talking about what this should be.
Yeah, it's a really interesting spot because, like, internally, we thought Chord was playable at 1 without the Afflict, but, you know, it looked a little anemic. Like, just on read, you're like, you know, is that a card to get, like, excited about? It just felt like it was kind of missing something. And tagging on a power, it's about as little as we can give a card, realistically speaking. It's already conditional, so it's literally as little as we can give a card. It's not even a full power, right? So I think it made sense to release it that way. And it's one of those things where, yeah, like, I'm not sad if the right balance point for Deafening Chord winds up being it's a little less playable versus more playable. Like, I think it's a cool card. It's good and healthy to have cards like this around. I think that one of the things we've learned over the years, and I guess maybe learned is even the wrong word, because it's sort of been like an ongoing goal to, like, get to a point where we can kind of reduce the overall strength that's baked into, like, any one tech card and allow it to exist across a wider spectrum. That's what eventually really made, like, the nerf to Shang-Chi possible, was, like, we'd gotten to that point where we're like, okay, we've got enough other stuff kind of carrying water for everything else in the game that we don't have to put the strongest bit into this one guy. Like, we can let Shadow King pick up some slack. We can let Red Guardian, we can pick up some slack. We have Cosmic Ghost Rider. Like, we can have Enchantress be weird. Like, there's a bunch of different stuff now that can all kind of do a different piece of the job better or worse depending on what you're targeting, which is good.
You've activated my trap card here a little bit, because I also pitched Cosmic Ghost Rider getting some points of power back. And this is the entirety of my logic here. I'm just going to throw out the logic train. Feel free to pick it apart. That's kind of what I want you to do. Deafening Chord, Red Guardian, Cosmic Ghost Rider. Those are 3 members of the same family. It's the 3 bears from Goldilocks, right? That's what's going on here. I think that if you're going to have 3 cards that do a similar thing at different costs, that in that world, Cosmic Ghost Rider's body is way too small, and Deafening Chord was previously way too large, relatively speaking.
I can buy that.
Is there a reason why Cosmic Ghost Rider was, and I mean this, like really harshly treated in going to 5/6 when that happened? Like what? That was the one where it was like, they're doing all these tech nerfs. I'm chill with it. I get it. Cosmic Ghost Rider was the one where I was like, oh, geez, are we sure? Like that was just like, whoa, even at the time. And now I feel like I just want him back. If we're going to get rid of a card like Deafening Chord, it's just like, there's got to be something I can do in this space. Make it the expensive one. I don't care. I'll go out of my way to play the expensive one, but I got to be able to do something.
I think the premise that you're saying is reasonable. The element of it, I think, and it's pretty common to like not consider is like, we're not trying to find like what is the exact healthiest, most balanced spot for the game to be like in every 2-week interval. Like it's okay for there to be like 2 weeks where it's like, oh, things like get a little wild, and then we choose which thing wrangles it in. And maybe it's Cosmic Ghost Rider, or maybe those 2 weeks happen and we're like, actually, like what if we did this instead? Like, and Cosmic Ghost Rider's one of those options where it's fairly generically powerful in what it does. It like affects a lot of decks relatively equally. So if he's the best option, then you're kind of towing more towards that like old Shang-Chi territory where like maybe he's in too many of the positions because he's so good at it. And you certainly don't want to get to a spot where people are considering things like, oh, I'm playing this deck that's like trying to play him and then absorbing man plus something else on turn 6. And it's like, okay, well, that's a little, you want to make sure he's a fine choice, not the best tech choice, I think. So while I might be inclined to agree that maybe the nerf we gave him was a little too harsh, it's also one of those nerfs where it's like, it's not the end of the world for that to be too harsh. Spending a little time with him weak before spending time with him strong, and vice versa, like actually adds texture to the game in a way that leaving him the same all the time is not necessarily going to do as effectively.
Speaking of rubber banding between weak and strong, Storm, that point of power, I'll just put it to you like this. It's unjust at this point now that you guys have fixed War Machine. Well, what's... Again, like, I hear the argument from texture here, right? Like, maybe this just isn't a card you want to be thinking about all the time. Like, Storm has some Professor X stuff going on where it's like, this is a remarkably unfun thing for your opponent a lot of the time. And there are other cards in that space where it's like, I think these cards could easily justify getting buffed on balance, but I wouldn't do it. Jean Grey's a great example.
Yeah.
Black Bolt, just cards that are like, this would be cool, and you could make it stronger. They're not good, but it's a net negative to the game if these cards are better. And how would you go about thinking about spaces like that? Because I do feel like Storm could be a 3/2, because, I mean, what's it going to do? Make Cerebro too good? Like, I feel like that's fine, right? But I do think like this general space of cards is something that's probably worth talking about, and that's kind of what I want to hear about here, if that's possible.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, one of the things we think about with our OTAs is certainly trying to get like a good balance of buffs and nerfs. Like we want there to be things that we're creating excitement for, and when we're also, obviously losing some. And Storm's in one of those spots where it kind of eats a buff slot, but actually, like sentiment-wise, is more of a nerf type thing, because there's definitely a huge contingent of the audience who'll just be like, I can't believe that you're buffing Storm. Like their reaction to the buff will be negative, whereas most buffs get received positively. I'm not saying that reaction is like right or wrong. Like everyone should react how they feel, of course, to the gameplay. But I can certainly see the case for it, because like the world where Storm is like in the best deck is probably a world we just want to avoid most of the time. It's a pretty tough world to be in. Storm being in like just a good deck or a tier 2 deck, like yeah, much more reasonable, but still kind of towing the line, and it's tough to shoot. So it's the sort of spot where it's like, well, if we're going to roll those dice, we should probably wait for like a time when it's worth rolling. I think that's one thing that probably I don't think we really ever talked about, but when we're exiting a metagame that has been like really contentious or had like some big problems, I usually caution like don't take as a big swing or or I should say like a risky swing where like you don't know the outcome of the swing. So it's like if people are frustrated after 4 weeks of the dragon, and then you pop into like, well, now it's going to be 2 to 4 weeks of whatever miscalculation we made on Storm. It's like, yeah, like maybe just put 2 weeks of like a nice time in between those two options if you're going to pursue them. So I think it makes sense to kind of hold off on things that have low upside, high risk until you're in a spot where you're like, actually, things are a little boring. Let's try something a little that might be spicy. And if it's not, no worries. You get another shot 2 weeks later to make things spicy again.
So I think you might end up repeating yourself on this one. This one, my Discord, I posted this and they were like, that's clickbait. You're clickbaiting. But I genuinely believe this one. Like, I genuinely want to do this, or at least something proximate to it. I did Fantomex to 4.9, and I realize those numbers might be incorrect. But largely the point I was driving at is that these sort of questy type activates, especially the really expensive ones, it feels like are asking players so much. And if the payoff isn't there for it in an immediate way, they just kind of get thrown in the dumpster and never really dealt with or played or investigated. And they're so weird and so odd, and it becomes important to incentivize players to actually engage with them. And this was sort of the driving premise behind what I did with Lin Li, which is actually, they did something very similar with Lin Li, but a little bit, I would argue, I don't even know if I would say it's safer, but it was a very similar space. Theirs is probably stronger, but safer at the same time, which I guess you would describe as a better buff. Actually, when you put it in those terms, stronger but safer sounds like a better idea.
It depends. And it's kind of about like what the range of what you're trying to do is. Like, I would say like on the merits, I don't explicitly mind your suggestion for Fantomex. It might be, too over or whatever. The trick of it is more like the issue with a card that is kind of polarized around a quest like this is I usually like to try and figure out what's the way I can polarize towards the quest more. Because like if I'm just bringing up the floor on failure, like the Fantomex deck isn't actually getting more fun. It's winning more, but it's not a more fun deck. Because if the problem was that this card fails at its quest too often, then just making it a stronger card doesn't change its failure rate at its quest. And that's where the joy should really live for a card like this, I think. So I would probably be more inclined to figure out how can I increase a number or something. Obviously, like his text box doesn't have a lot of dials for that. That's like a big part of the problem. And as a card, I think he's structured a little strangely because, if you're just thinking about it really objectively from like a design game flow standpoint, like the structure of Fantomex is very much a card that wants to be a 2-cost card. Like he's very Morbius like in that regard. Like you play him and then you go to play the rest of the game to figure out how to turn him on. Like that's the whole kind of deal. And you can compare that to, obviously there's a very similar type card in Dracula, which is not a Morbius, right? Like he's like, no, I play him and now I get to this very specific position and capitalize on what he does. And Fantomex is much closer, I think, to Morbius in that he requires a little bit more specific effort, and obviously, like, he's on board and it's face up, like what he's threatening and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, his effect would not be like we'd have to. I don't think you can do -2 on a 2-cost card like at really any numbers with this effect. It's just so strong, and so like 2-cost hazmat with a bunch of conditions type vibe is just like not a very appealing card itself. So I think he's kind of stuck in like this weird spot where his structure screams like I want to be cheaper so that you get more time and energy to do the hard part, and then the actual payoff though is like I can't be cheaper. I would be unimpressive cheaper, and I'm not quite strong enough for the payoff where I am.
You think you could
so like maybe
him?
The answer is figure out a 3-cost. Yeah. That's would be probably my direction if I was like going to work and be like, all right, let's figure out how to buff Fantomex. I'd probably want to start off with like, let's put him at 3 and figure out a stat line and see like what we think works in that regard. But that's also like got its own weird bits to it because like the cards that pay off Fantomex also as an archetype like have a lot of specifics around 3 specifically, and 4 is actually a spot where they're not doing a lot of the time. A lot of those turns are 3 and 1, which maybe that works. That might just mean that it's the correct way to go.
It did, like, if you say 3 Fantomex, I start thinking about like Dak and Surfer, right? Gambit's a 3. Like I'm just gonna start doing things in that space, right? I did try to figure out a way to buff his effect and make it more easy to do. I came up with two.
Yeah.
I think both of them probably too stupid, but I want to run both of them by you. The first one is take some power off him and just his effect says -3 now. Probably a ridiculous thing to do in a world where Prodigy exists. Like, I probably just don't think you can do it, but it would be cool if you could Kamehameha people.
Directionally, though, it makes sense. Like, if you're like, I want to make this quest strong, it's like, okay, well, now this card's going to be like bonkers when you hit the quest and the rest of the time. Like, at that point, he's kind of a man spider type deal, where it's just like, this feels ludicrous, except for every time it doesn't feel ludicrous, where it feels like nothing.
Yeah.
So.
And then the second one was, and I think this one sounds riskier than it is, and I'll go into this one. Give him the ability to do -1 for discard and then another -1 for destroy. And I know you're going to be like, that lets him go in a discard deck and just be a discard card. No discard deck is playing that card. No destroy deck is playing that card. It just is not happening. You are not doing that for activate -1 your opponent's board. You are not. It is not happening. That is my contention. So at the very least, he does something in his dedicated decks without risking going into the other one. But both of those felt like, the first one felt stupid. The second one, I don't think there's enough space on the card. And so I just ended up with 4/9.
Yeah, I think that's tricky. I'm not sure how I would word that if I wanted to do it. I have thought about similar type stuff where you do like a multiplier, or you do something a little bit more in the like space where we're counting up, where it's like, you actually have to do both twice or something, and we give him like a 0/2 0/2 or something like that, where the quest gets to be harder. But I think like the quest is already kind of hard enough. Like it already demands enough from you as a deck builder that it's not trivial. So making it harder like lets us justify ticking the number up, but I think it's already at the appropriate difficulty threshold, which is why I'd probably just be trying to find like a healthier output. Like maybe the effect should just be different. Like I could totally believe that that's the answer. We should just be deleting the -2 afflict to everything and find a different output that's more fun for the deck. I could buy that. Because right now, as an activate, he's actually not that distant from being an end of game card, right? Like you can activate him, but like
never are.
Mostly, you're just doing it on turn 6. It's if your opponent's doing something particularly strange, like Black Panthering or whatever, like maybe now there's more value to trying to activate it early and avoid their Zola being as good.
He is almost a card that could be like an objective card. The data mine mechanic for the March season, I think. Where it's like it's basically just a quest, right? He's a card that it almost makes me wonder if like, because you look at him, you look at Warlock. The big thing that I'm driving at with those cards is like, it feels like there is a quest on top of them being pretty expensive activates, and that's the wrong place to put a quest, if that makes sense. And now that there is an objective card, I almost wonder if like they'd go back and do that. I don't know. You're probably not allowed to comment on data mines. Actually, it just occurs to me.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Okay. All right. Next up is Patriot, which my pitch here is very simple. If Cerebro can do it, so can he. And if V-Hand can do it, so can he. My pitch for Patriot is either it's Cerebro or it's V-Hand, but what it is right now, where it's just dramatically worse than both, is unacceptable to me as a Patriot. This is not. As a very vanilla man, I am not okay with this discrimination against my kind. And I know he's like a more important Series 3 card than a lot of Series 3 cards are. I know that, right? Because he is such like an archetype unto himself. He's like a Wong. He's like a Venom. You get him. You get like part of a deck when you get him out of Series 3. It is different than a lot of Series 3 cards. Like if you get Drax out of Series 3, okay. But you get one of these guys, it's like an actual thing. I just wonder, like, how much do you think is actually being risked by keeping him this weak? And is there any concern that, like, we don't want to buff Patriot because we're about to release like a season where we're doing high Evo synergy stuff, and we just don't want that to be a thing people are thinking about with the vanilla cards when we're doing high Evo things? Is that the kind of thing that would come up?
So it's mostly I agree with a lot of what you said. The concerns around Patriot are kind of weird and specific to him. The one is we kind of just finished up this like vanilla buff, basically, where we moved all the vanillas up a few notches, which we've been planning for a while. Small potatoes, but like it doesn't really make sense to move Patriot before moving those, assuming you know you're going to move all of those, which we have. Like that's been in the works for like a year, is figuring out like when and how and the right time and things like that. And then the other thing is that unlike the other like Victoria Hand and Cerebro, would not be nearly as disruptive to the new player experience, where Patriot's positioned as like a deck you can get to like pretty quickly after those first few, and it would be massively disruptive there. Like Patriot's even in, at least I think it still is. I haven't checked, this week or whatever. But Patriot had been for a long time like one of the earliest bundles that you get offered as a new player in like the set 5 or 7 day like bundle track. So like attaching too much strength to something that we're like immediately selling a new player like sends a message we're not super thrilled about, as far as like, oh, like you can just have the best deck, like buy this card or whatever, or have a deck that people complain about, even if it's not the best version of it at that point in your playing career. That's something we're a little wary of. That said, I otherwise like just generally agree with you, and I think it's like kind of this tricky position where I think Patriot is it's cool if Patriot is competitive. Like it's really hard for me to fathom a world where I'm like, how unfun. Patriot's a good deck when we've had decks like Cerebro and Victoria Hand that I also think are fun to have be good, but can cross up the line where it's like, no, this is too much. Like it's hard for me to imagine the world where people are like, no, Patriot was too much. Like that's tough. But it's very easy to imagine that being the world for the new user experience, where it's like, oh no, like you can just get like your Patriot and your Mystique online like really quickly, and actually that's pretty frustrating for a bunch of people who are not necessarily prepared for that higher form of war.
Sorry, just higher form of war got me a little bit there. I when I looked at this compared to Cerebro and compared to V-Hand, it seems pretty clear like this is the worst of them in approximately all cases that do not involve the card Ultron. Like if you are doing literally anything other than Ultron, this guy is not going to be better than either of those two cards, or building around either of those two cards. But if I'm not mistaken, Ultron is part of like a gift deck that you get at the beginning of the game now, and that carries an even bigger risk here, where I'm pretty sure you get Ultron and you get Mystique, and then you will get this like newly buffed Patriot, and suddenly that actually is a reasonable problem for the early game, I think. And I guess
and
go ahead.
Maybe it is like it's the sort of thing where like we don't have the ability to like easily test that metagame, because we just don't play in it ourselves. It's like a lot of time to monitor it with how many changes we make. Like it would kind of just require too much effort. So yeah,
it is just one of those things where it's like, I keep thinking that as technology develops for players to get like the Thanos deck early and all of that stuff, it becomes less of a problem to buff a card like this. But because of Patriot's the thing that he is, him alone, he is like the only card that's like, no, this actually is really problematic to deal with, right? Because of what we do on the early track. That's crazy. I just I hadn't really considered it.
Yeah, that's what I mean, kind of where it's like, I think it's plausible that it would be fine now, but like relative to, a year ago or 2 years ago, like making the same kind of decision. But it's a pretty hard thing to measure without just dropping it in. And it's in a weird spot where I wouldn't want to just drop it in.
My Lin Li pitch was adding 2 power to the card by adding 2 power to the sword on the ongoing, because I thought the most interesting stuff I saw from Lin Li was like Moonstone, Frigga copy things that this card was doing that were very dependent on the ongoing and would benefit heavily from the ongoing getting a lot of the buff. What they ended up doing was 1 additional power to the ongoing, 1 additional power to Lin Li. I just kind of want to get your take on like, because we talked about this during the Fantomex thing, theirs seems not only safer, but also probably stronger. And that seems like if I can get a change that I would describe in terms of safer and stronger, I would just sort of instinctively say that's probably a better change.
A lot of the time, yeah. The difference comes up, as I mentioned in Fantomex, where like, if you want to lean into like polarizing the quest, you usually just want to make it like as you did. I would say like your change was doing that. So it sort of just kind of matters about like what the goals are. Like I think Lin Li being popular is a slightly more fun card to see more often than Fantomex might be, which is just like the manner in which it generates power feels more like my sandcastle versus kicking at yours, even though they're all just numbers. So I think it's definitely the kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I do think the +2 to the ongoing is like the quote the riskier of the changes. So my guess, I guess I shouldn't say guess, but my inclination would be definitely that there's a little bit more risk in putting power into the ongoing. So if you think you can get close enough to target without doing it, then it seems fine to just not. And also, the card is really cool and fun, and mostly I think you want to kind of get people in the door on it. Like it was when we were testing for the season, it was one of my favorite cards. Like when I played the first version of it, and I don't even remember what the first version was. I think it was like, I don't remember if it had an ongoing, but I know it was all about doubling the sword. Like that was what instead of the like it was built all around doing that. And so like my first playtest, I had like, 2 20 power Lins or whatever. And I was like, this is awesome and fun. And also we should change the way that it is structured to avoid this being the thing that you do. But I still really want to do this fantasy because I did think the idea of like having to come pick up the sword with your guy is like just a really compelling journey to take, similar to Thor and Mjolnir. Like it's just a really fun story.
Yeah, like this is the oldest myth in the book. It's King Arthur Excalibur. It's you go on your quest and you get the sword at the end of the quest, and then like it's this is a guy I love his design. There are some cards where I'm like, this is pretty cool. Lin Li is a card where it's like, this is just so evocative and so different and so interesting. But the other thing with him is, because he is so different, I feel like there's an investment of power necessary to make people want to do the different thing. He's so off from every other move card, where every other move card is like, the quest is functionally move me X amount of times, where X is as many as possible. And he is so different from that, and his board space restrictions are so notable that like it's just a very oddball type of card. And when you have like an oddball, my instinct is every oddball this is the same as the Fantomex. All these oddballs need just like 2 free points of power. Just if it's too much, it's too much. But like that was just sort of my thought process. What do you think about that kind of, balancing ethos?
Yeah, I think you're in the right of it. Like if it's gonna be tricky to do, but it is cool to do, make the cool thing strong. Like that's something that I think is like a good heuristic of game design, that it can be oddly easy to miss, like especially when you're kind of in the weeds trying to figure out like the right balance points, or like you find what you think is the best deck, and you're almost certainly always wrong about that anyway. So like, what does that matter, and so on and so forth. But I generally like to try and approach it that way. But I've used this metaphor before. It's like a lot of people, it seems so obvious in hindsight when like something goes wrong or whatever, but like game balance is so much closer to like, trying to kick a field goal or a soccer goal or whatever, where it's like where you're aiming, but it's not going to land exactly where you shoot it. And sometimes it'll work out either way, but sometimes you'll just like bonk the upright or miss completely and be like, oh, well. And every time you didn't do anything different. Like you lined up for the kick the same way, you had the same team helping you do it all, and it just turns out different sometimes. It's just the natural variation in the process.
You familiar with the Ninja tweet where he's like, I just don't understand how professional kickers just miss kicks. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're correct. You started the sentence correctly. You do not understand. I read criticisms like that all the time. And that's immediately what I think. It's like, I don't know why they just. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You do not know why they just.
Last up, I slapped 2 points of power on Caiera because I hate putting her in my deck, and I want to hate putting her in my deck less. Like, I really, this is like a Killmonger issue, but I have never like once chosen to put Caiera in my deck. I've always been forced to put Caiera in my deck, which I think gives her like a really. There are some cards where it's like there's a natural, not necessarily inbuilt bad feeling to them, and I think Caiera is one of those cards. Another example would be, I think, not analogous, but like relatively similar space, like Mole Man, where it's like, why am I blowing up a resource for a card that isn't very good? Like, what is, like, why is there an additional feel bad attached to this card when it already isn't good? And I guess largely my question is, how would you approach a card like that has these sort of pieces of additional baggage attached to it, whether they be part of the card's actual text or part of like the implications of the card's text, like Caiera?
Yeah. It's tricky because Caiera is one of in the same kind of like school of card that can like kind of just as easily become the villain as be the hero, you know?
Yeah.
Because
Cosmo.
Cosmo and Armor obviously like similar, like where it's like, no, this isn't actually messing with what you're doing. It's just protecting what I'm doing. And what I'm doing is really frustrating. And it doesn't take a lot for, you know, a Surtur or a Sauron type card to like come out and just push things. And it's like, oh, okay, well now like we built in all these release valves for you to be able to deal with these decks. And then we made one of their counter cards so strong that your release valves don't matter. So that's the situation I want to avoid with Caiera, which I do think like putting her above the vanilla curve like kind of risks that, where it's like, well, now there's just like you're not getting it. There's no compensation for her effect at all. And I'll to be clear, like I do think generally like every card in the game should basically be better than a vanilla. If you think your card is equal or worse than a vanilla, like there's a common misunderstanding that like, you know, because vanilla Misty Knight's like a 1/3, like that means that all of the 1 costs that are have a upside effect can't be 1/3, and it's like, no, that's not how it should work. Like Misty Knight should be the worst of them.
Vanilla is not balanced. You do not want a game full of vanillas. That is not the line.
Like, what would be the goal of making Misty Knight just eminently playable by having every card be plus or minus Misty Knight, right? What's the point? So yeah, I wouldn't want to, but still, like that would be, I think, too much on Caiera, both like in breaking the paradigm and also just running the risk of becoming more problematic than you want. Like, you know, when she's the like 12th card in decks that just happen to have some big 6s that it's good to protect, that's the area where you're like, red alert, as a vibe. So I'd probably be more inclined to figure out a way to make her like weaker at the core job, but easier to play, maybe. So like, you know, a 2-cost version that only covers the other locations, for example, or get really weird, you know, like she covers 1s if she's in the left location and 6s if she's in the right, or something bizarre like that, like might be a direction to consider. I think those are like, I don't love either of those. I'm just kind of indicating the way I would try and go about thinking on the card is, how can I find the right spot to make it do like its good job without risking it being another one, being a worse problem than it actually solves. I agree with the. I mean, at the time, I thought it was really clever to merge 1 and 6s together, and that does add to some of the risk of the card too, where it's like you're kind of doubling how things can go awry here. Because I think, you know, if we were to just take off the 6 part and make her much stronger, I think that's an area where it's probably a little less risky these days. I think there is a time where being able to fill your board with a bunch of unkillable 1 costs would be problematic in Marvel Snap. I don't think we really live in that world anymore. There's enough strategies that can kind of go over the top of just presenting 20-ish power at each location, which is what that kind of deck aims to do. So
that was exactly what I was going to ask. Like, could you just take the 6s off and then you wouldn't be worried about this at all? Like, could you do 3 6 and then just 1s Caiera? Like, that feels like the kind of thing. Like, I'm a big zoo guy, just like at heart. I like the idea of a deck that plays all of its cards and distributes them and manages its power in that way. And just, you know, coming from other card games, I like an aggro deck, you know? I'm into that. That's what I like. Even if nothing really maps onto that in Snap, the closest thing we have to like the style of gameplay I would like to play is, I think, Ramp. Like, when I'm talking about I want to play a deck where I make 2 decisions and it's arguable if either of them mattered, that's my guy. I'm a Ramp guy for that. Like,
for me, that was always the Dracula Zoo decks, where like you can play those decks with your brain totally turned off the whole time. It's just like, just add your hand up minus the number of remaining energy in the game and go.
I love a flowchart aggro, aggro deck. I'm all about that. Give me like whatever the Marvel Snap equivalent of Experimental Frenzy is, and I am in. I will play that deck. Glenn Jones, thank you so much for taking the time. Any final messages to the millions and millions of the Rocks fans, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the video and always like kind of reading people's balance ideas and directions. It's one of those things where I kind of wish I could chat with people more about, but it's not usually super useful, and also maybe not that entertaining. So we'll see how this video does.
Hey, look, for me, entertainment value is secondary. I brought this concept up in my Discord, and people were like, "Oh, I get it. You like this is double duty for you. You're getting content, and then you're also like doing like a backdoor job application." And I was like, "Damn, that's exactly what I'm doing." That was exactly the thing that this was. Damn, I didn't realize it was that transparent, but I guess it was. Glenn Jones, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.